What's everyone? What's up, YouTube? Hope you guys doing well. Welcome back to another video. So today we're diving into the mystery of the snare. I see so many people going on about how to get a good snare, how to get that snare sitting tight, how to get that snare snappy as hell, you know, crisp and clear. So I'm going to give you two examples. Maybe they're not the best. You can be the judge of that. I kind of like them. Personally, I think they can be better. There's always room for improvement, but I think these are a good two examples of the different ways you can really go about getting your snare to sit tight within the mix. And I'm also just going to go through a few things that you need to consider when implementing these techniques, or when implementing the idea of a snare or putting in a snare into your track. So without further delay, let's jump right in. The first thing I'm going to talk about, and I want you to be aware of, is tonality. Right, and I've got an example here you'll see in a few moments explaining what I mean by this. And essentially it's your snare needs to fit the track. Do you know, like, you can't, I don't know if everyone on this channel, probably they are, but everyone, if they're familiar with the Hitech Snare, you can't be going and putting that in a techno track unless it works. But majority speaking, you can't go put it in a house track, a nice bouncy house track, and expect it to be coherent and work with the track. Okay, so the first, and I think the most important rule when considering the snare that you want to use for the track is tonality. And does it fit the track? I mean, I don't know if everyone's familiar with the Hitech Snare, but I'm pretty sure by now everyone is. You can't be going and putting that kind of snare into a techno track or a house track unless it fits the tone and the vibe of the track, but I highly doubt it. So I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to say is does the snare fit the vibe of the track that you're going for? Does it fit within the mix, and does it have the correct tonality to it? I remember I made a track a few years ago. It took me 4 years to make the track, and I kept switching out the snares because they just weren't fitting in. They weren't cohesive with the rest of the track. So I've got two examples here for you. The one track, this one example over here. This one over here is actually a recent release. I think it released on Triptych Records in December sometime. Just two different, I guess, methods that I use when I implement or when I make my snares. So let's actually start with this one over here. Cool, so as you can hear, it's actually a layered snare, so there's two snares being combined to make one. So I've soloed over here. So you can see now if I and what this is doing is it's just adding that extra bit of layer or harmonics, if you want to call it harmonics, to the snare. You're kind of just layering them up, just like we do, with the hi-hats. You layer up your snare to fill up the space, to fill up any gaps within the frequency range. But this is also comes down to snare selection. These two snares have to work well together. They have to kind of gel together and sound different separately, but together they kind of sound like one. So what I've done is taken two snares over here, and this is the Hitech snare I was talking about. Now everyone's familiar with it. Pretty much layering up your snares is one way to go about it, and it's a method that I use consistently throughout a lot of tracks, and I think it works great, especially when your snare is kind of not sitting in the mix quite right, and it just seems like it's dipping within the mix, and it's not so prominent as you want it to be. Adding another layer of snare can help beef up that snare and just bring another layer. Like I say, I think the most important rule when mixing your snares is compression and EQ. Your compression, I think, is the most important side of when you're mixing your snares, and that's because you want it to sit tight, but you also don't want to ruin the transient, but you also want to capture the transient at just the right moment. And to do this, it is usually a very short attack. I don't go lower than 12 milliseconds, but I don't go higher than maybe 15 or 16 milliseconds, and a very short release. Between 15, this is why I use ABLETON's compressor, because you can go lower than 50 milliseconds. So I've got this one over here acting at 27, releasing at 27.9, and this one over at 50. If you have it too long, so let's say past 80 milliseconds, the compressor is going to be working too much or over a longer period of time, and your dynamics are going to get squashed over a period of time. And let's say the first snare is going to sound quite nice, but then the fifth snare or sixth, seventh snare is the dynamics, or the overall dynamics, are actually going to dip, and then it's going to just kind of keep on dipping the longer that your release time is. So again, going back to the compressor, you know, short attack, short release. Your attack, I think, is way more important than your release, because obviously, you know, it's a no-brainer with the release, but your attack, you need to be a little bit more intricate with it and just fine-tune it a little bit depending on the transient of the specific snare that you're using. Ratio is also very important, all depending on, again, the dynamics of the snare, how loud the snare is, and how it fits within the track again. So add it up. Okay, you can see over here that sounds nice, but you can see that that snare is just dipping within the mix a little bit, and so if we add another layer to it, there's a perfect example of, you know, they sound different individually, but together they sound like one thing. It's, you know, when you listen to it, it's like you're listening to one snare, right? But there's two snares going on over here. What I've done with this is I've just panned it 5 just a little bit, just to broaden the space, widen the space a bit. And again, the EQ is also very important. I mean, all depending on what type of snare you're using. You know, like a reggae kind of snare, you'd want your frequency range to be sitting between about 120 hertz to about 250 hertz, because that's where the meat of it is. You know, the very like low, snappy kind of sound. The same thing goes if you're making jungle or liquid drum bass, anything like that. So just find out where, you know, the most prominent frequency range is for your snare, and then obviously try and control those frequencies, because if you're layering your snare especially, you don't want those frequencies to kind of combine together, and then you're increasing your dynamic output. So you want to you know, obviously reduce any resonance frequencies and just shape the snare to fit the other snare and vice versa, and then obviously shaping the snare to fit the track, the overall track. So I mean, with this snare, you know, like there wasn't really much I needed to do, because I feel like it did fit within the track quite nicely. See that, now that just sounds fine on its own, but adding some compression and EQ is just fine tuning it a little bit, and obviously the compressor is just to maintain the consistency throughout the track. With regards to this, also the second snare is also the same thing. Now I want to give you an example of, you know, obviously a snare that doesn't fit the track really. Now we can go in and actually use the same technique of just compression and EQ. What you can also do, if you really want to, is just add a little bit of saturation, maybe some multiband compression. I wouldn't go that far personally, but yeah, man, it's music, there's no rules. But yeah, with this, let's follow the same rules, and let's follow the same rules. So I usually like to keep my ratio between 3 and 4. The reason I have it on this one is it's so low is because, like I said, you know, I don't need to do a lot to the snare, so I'm just kind of trying to capture the tip of the transient over there. But that snare is hitting pretty hard, so we'll give it about 3, and then also again, it's there, and it's got quite a long tail, so let's try it at 70, and then we'll work our way back. Yeah, I was right at 70. Cool. And let's add our EQ. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find any resonant frequencies that I just want to kind of take out. So I'm shaping the snare to kind of fit the mix a little bit better. And let's actually go in and add a saturator. Drums. I'm just, you know, doing this for the sake of the tutorial, for ease, quick, speed. There you go. That's the word. Let's hear it on its own. Oh. I mean, to me, that's a really shit sounding snare anyway. But I'm sure given a certain type of track, maybe a hard style track, you know, maybe a hard jump up drum and bass, I don't know, type of track. My point here is you need to choose a snare that fits the mix. So what I would actually go and do, because I really like the initial hit of this snare, is I would chop it off. I'll chop off the tail and then layer a snare, a more snappy snare like that on top of it. See, it's got a nice punchy attack to it, but the sound or the type of snare it doesn't fit the track, doesn't fit the overall tone of the track, you know, which is why it's a perfect example of not choosing the right snare. Anyway, going on to the second example, I mean, I've done a lot more to the snare, as you can see, and this is a little bit more advanced, a little bit more thinking outside the box and, you know, breaking the rules a little bit more. Cool, let's take everything off and I'll show you what I've gone and done. It's always better to compress first, especially with snares and drums and everything like that, because you're controlling the dynamics and then from there you can kind of shape the sound. Because if you're boosting stuff, I don't know, it's just generally a better idea to always compress first. You're going to control the dynamics before you control the harmonics. So that's the snare on its own. Let's see how it sounds. See, you can tell, like, it's got right kind of tone for the track, but it just needs a little bit more mixing and editing and shaping to kind of really gel nicely with the track. As you can see, I've not layered another snare on top of it. This snare just works well on its own. So what we're going to do, compress, you see over there, ratio of 3. Now the milliseconds, very low, because again, the transients, it was just a bit too much. See, it's just grabbing that transient and shaping the snare just how I want it to. I should probably have the release a little bit lower, to be honest. So that's yeah, you know, I can own up and that's a mistake. That's a mistake on my part. Okay, I take that back. It actually the release time actually works with that. Again, you know, there's no rules, but you just kind of have to try and think of the sound and think of the dynamics and the transients of the sound and try and understand why you're choosing the attack time to be a certain attack time and why you're choosing the release time to be a certain release time. Because everything I've said, it still stands true. You know, if the release time, the longer the release time, the longer the compressor is going to stay active, you know, the more dynamics are going to be squashed as the track goes on. And then I've got my EQ, just controlling. See, it's just, I'm just shaping it for the tonality of the track. Now this is a really interesting technique that was taught to me by Amras, and it's adding a phaser onto your snares just to kind of completely change the sound of the snare, completely not change it, but just flip it on its head and really kind of, I don't know, for me, the way I can say is it's really like pinpointing, you know, the harmonics that I want to use. Brilliant. You see about 132. I'm just giving it some slight feedback, 2 poles space, and I mean these kind of settings aren't gonna work for every single snare. You might not even want to put a phaser on your snare. It all depends on, does it sound good, does it not, you know, the old saying. And then I've gone and put a reverb on it, and I've just gone again and shaped the sound a little bit more over here because I felt like the phaser was of it. And there you have it. There you have it. So I think this is a way better example of really shaping the snare to fit your track. But again, the original sample I used had the original or the initial tonality that I thought would work best with this track. Anyway, I think I'm going on way too long about this, but I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you've been able to understand it. And yeah, please go try these techniques out on your tracks. Let me know what it does for you, if it works, if it helps, you know, and hopefully, you know, your tracks and your snares will sound a lot more sharper, a lot more crisper. I think the key takeaways over here is your compression time, so attack and release time, layering, and then the bonus one is the phaser. But don't forget that EQ. Anyway, that's it for the video. Thanks very much for watching. Leave a like or comment down below if you enjoyed this video. Leave a comment down below if you want to see more of these videos. If you want to see, if you have any suggestions, please, again, let me know. Let me know what you're struggling with, and I'm happy to try and help. But before that, smash that subscribe button if you want to see more. Hit that little bell button on the side if you want to get a notification for when I release another video. Anyway, that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one.